Hi everyone, it's Jerry. This is game 1 of 2 from the semifinals of the 2025 Freestyle Chess Grand Slam Tour Knockout. On the white end, Vincent Keymer playing against Magnus Carlsen. Classical time controls, 90 minutes apiece, 30-second increment throughout. This is start position number 360. Very complicated start. This one here, maybe one of the most complicated of the entire event. What sticks out to me with this arrangement? These pawns unprotected. This here is maybe not out of the question to go in for a quick smothered mate. May seem a bit outlandish to play in this way, but might there be an idea like this to provoke an early castles? That's another thing that sticks out with this initial arrangement. Each side could castle on their first move. This would be an only move for black in this situation. Is there value in provoking the early castling? Maybe. The knight, not so easily extracted from that a5 square. So anyhow, this is one thing that certainly grabs my attention with this initial arrangement. Another are these cornered knights. What role are they going to play in this game? These are some of the top moves the computer is looking at. Note the moves that are not highlighted. It's not suggesting either center pawn advance. You know, when you play with regular chess d4, that d4 pawn has the support of a queen. Not the case here. If you're playing d4, you're only helping out a bishop. Is this really a fantastic diagonal for this piece? This is also, you know, a bit of an oddball piece with this arrangement, a bishop on e1. E4, what piece are you helping out with e4? Not a bishop, not a queen, and you certainly don't want to develop your king like this. So you're not really extracting a whole lot playing with either center pawn with this particular arrangement. What you would squeeze a lot out of, if you start out with f4, notice how a start of f4 would help out bishop, rook, queen, and knight to some degree. Similarly, f5 would do the same for black. Now, anticipating this f5 move by black, Keymer's approach here is to start with g4. You want to play with f5 here? Well, I'm going to be able to chop, develop with tempo, and white could maybe claim I have a stronger pawn presence in the center, trading the g pawn for the f pawn. It's an interesting start, g4. Carlsen's reply, knight g6. In comes knight b3, e5, knight g3. So nice coordination between the knight and pawn. From here, we have f6. And now comes c4. So in response to c4 here, Carlsen ends up castling. What I want to point out is that instead of this f6 move, if white puts another pawn in the center, normally seen as very good, white would already be winning. That's what the computer's saying. Winning. After the c4 move to challenge that duo. The idea here is that after this capture, knight a5, I initially made these moves right out of the gate to highlight that sensitive point. Knight a5 here, a far more effective post. There's some more options available in this situation. The c pawn and the g pawn have moved, which means that the bishop and the queen could help interact with this knight. There are these open diagonals. Bishop getting to f5. Queen getting to h1. Things could turn this quickly. Things can be decisive this quickly in the game. So first of all, how would black address the threat here on b7? If you go with castle, there you go. There's a bishop check. And here's a queen sweeping in to coordinate with the knight. And there is this idea of an early sacrifice here on c6. White is in the driver's seat. This is considered winning. Look at the difference between the queens here. So proceed with caution Could be risky playing in the center like this with d5. It is f6, c4, and from here, Carlsen castles. Computer doesn't like castles here. It's looking at c6 as top. c6 opens some, makes some room for the bishop, the knight, but more importantly, the c6 move helps fight for that d5 square. And we're going to see why this is important soon enough. Now, how it plays out after castles here, Keymer plays in the center with d4. Now, in this situation, if black tries to increase the pressure on c4 by forming this battery, white's response can be d5, blocking the battery. But if c6 was played in this game rather than castles, and white went with d4 here, now you can play this without d5 shutting down the battery. In fact, black would be for choice in this situation. So if c6 is on board and you try and continue with d4 here, this would be very strong. Why is it so strong? Well, what would white now do about this threat to win the pawn here on c4? You don't really have a great option. Computer says best is to drop the knight back. Not at all appealing. This isn't stable. There's b6. You dive in here, your knight will be trapped. And if you make what feels like a healthy move, bishop d3, it's not stable. There's knight f4, and that's disruptive, targeting the bishop, these light squares. So this one little baby move really is super meaningful in this game, because what's going to end up happening, white establishes a very strong pawn on d5, and this paves the way for the pieces to find very good squares. So if you end up with a bad structure, your pieces don't really, they can't find any good squares. Bad structure, bad pieces, bad game. Good structure, could find good squares, good game. All right, we have an early castles in this one. Follow up, d4. And from here, black simply develops, increases the pressure on c4, and d5 is the reply. Now, how the computer wants to play it here, in response to this duo, it says break it up. And best follow-up here is with f4, cutting out the knight jumps, and leaning towards this queen capture on d4. So it might look like something like this, f4, and then the queen being the more efficient recapturer. In this setup, the queen is stable in the center. The knights starting out in the corner squares, neither are going to control these two center squares. Big difference with the queens in this situation. I want to also point out that if this advance and capture, if you're immediately recapturing, and then d5, c5 would be an excellent reply. White would be doing really well, controlling the knight, blocking up this d file. But what black could play, if white is simply recapturing like this, is c5, and only then a d5 break. And it's looking at castles from here, getting off of this d file. So some very sharp play can occur early on in this one, that is for sure. How it is played out here after castles, d4, knight b6, and there we go. We have a monster pawn. This is really the point that is worked around for pretty much the whole game by black. So that's mainly the bulk of the important pawn moves with this game. From here, we're really working now on fitting these pieces into the structure we have before us. So bishop developing to a very active square. It's blocked. f3, room for the queen, room for the bishop. In comes e4. Yeah, it's looking at bishop f2, e4 maybe. I don't know how to describe e4. It feels a bit like overkill with this f5 square controlling that point. To weaken that f4 square, maybe you could do without that. Bishop f2. A move that I found interesting here is that the computer has its eye on the following line. It wants to go with this idea. You ready? It's not one that was really on my radar, but it wants to go for this bishop for knight capture. Kind of odd to play it like this with this follow-up knight e4. And there's some tricks in the air. One is to capture on d6. Well, that's the main one. To capture on d6 and then smash away. Work on this pin here. And another detail is even if one day this knight is challenged, you may end up as black kicking this knight to an even better square, g5. And from that point, what is it doing? Coordinating with that big d5 pawn. I just found that one kind of interesting to duck this bad, very active, bad bishop for good bishop exchange and go for this knight exchange, bishop for knight exchange. Anyhow, how it is played out here, we have a very committal, we might say, e4, big hole on f4 created. Hops right to it. We get the light square bishop exchange. And from here, king c2. So that's a bit of a cute move. Cutting out any knight d3, also masking the rook for the moment from its defense over c4. Black's response develops bishop a7. It says you could go ahead and capture on c4, but it's risky to play in this way. Open c-file directly towards the king. Coordination with the pawn. There might be some tricks on this c6 square. It's saying some fancy knight move like this is available. If the queen is coming over here, there's a fork. All right, some fancy knight moves from there. Carlsen does not end up picking up the pawn. He develops bishop d2. There isn't a fancy knight move just yet to target the queen. You could just swipe the bishop. You have to go here for it to be defended. If you try bishop f2 here, that's running into bishop f2. There's knight h3 with the fork. So the arrangement is going to be like this in the game. With this setup, with this battery, the knight cannot land a fork to these two pieces. All right, knight h3, queen g2, and queen f2. In comes h5. Centralize the rook. He's gearing up for this c5 advance. The capture on g4 and some regrouping here. c5 break. It calls it around plus 0.3, but white is the one that is clearly pressing here. I mean, just look at how invasive these pawns are, and the rook's ideally placed right behind them. There's one good piece for Carlsen, this knight here, but it's easily worked around. That jump covered by the rook, covered by the king. King's not going to want to stay there for long, but well under control here for white. We get the capture on c5. If you don't capture on c5, that's going to be a problem, almost certainly. You're going to have to contend with an invasive 6th rank pawn. That's going to be a disaster for black, so it has to go. Now white has access to the c5 square. Bishop takes, g6, and just some more regrouping here. This is a best piece. It's going to be challenged shortly. First, the knight hops in, working well on that e6 square. Finally, we got that knight challenge. Knight's off, looking a bit more like regular old chess. Not some 960 position. Knight b5, queen c4, and from here, rook c8. Now, right around here, this pawn, if you capture it, well, it's a poison pawn. some support is required over this c7 pawn. So what's going to happen if queen takes h2? This knight is not a reliable defender of c7. White would be able to play a4. And after the knight moves, there you go, could sacrifice the knight. King takes knight, chop, chop. Also, white would have an answer to this one as well, hitting the knight, threatening a mate. You still go in for this capture here and follow-up check, and eventually there's going to be checkmate here, mate, and if here, check, checkmate. My point is that this h2 pawn in this position is poison. It's some coverage here, reliable defender now over this c7 pawn. Maybe now this is in the air. In comes a4, knight d4. Both knights are competing for that e6 square. Also, now that the knight is on d5, what's right around the corner for white is queen b4, threatening mate. Black pretty much needs to always be in a position to react to that move with rook b6. All right, white's reply here is g5. Very interesting idea. He's looking to break down this strong knight post. So black's reply in this game is with rook on c to d8. What is happening, first of all, if black goes in for this capture on h2 in this situation? If queen takes h2 here, there we go. Queen b4 is there. And black does not have now the response rook b6 because there would be knight d7 with a fork. The queen from h7 has that responsibility to cover this square. So this would not be a good idea. And Carlsen decided against this capture on g5. Why exactly? Well, if you take on g5, there was going to be a sacrifice, an exchange sacrifice, with this follow-up idea, e5, a very dangerous passed pawn. Black would have an only move. If he played in this way, this would be an only move situation for him. That only move, king to a8. If you play in a different way, for instance, rook b6, you could continue to run. Pawn takes pawn, there's knight takes a6, check, followed by queen takes rook. This only move for black, why is this an only move? Well, if you end up taking the rook in this situation, you end up getting the material back. There isn't a knight check, dark, light. You're going to get this piece back. So maybe a bit of a tricky move to spot, recognizing that in this position, you would have an only move. Probably not a good approach to take here. This is just way too dangerous to allow. So he decides against this capture after g5, no chop. He connects rooks. He gives some coverage over this e7 square. Maybe now the queen is ready to knock out the pawn. All right, we get the capture on f6, rook recapture, rook f1, and rook b6. That marks move 29. Quick update with the clocks. About 4 minutes for white, 8 minutes for black. Still have that 30-second increment. Now, a move that may be tempting here for white, the move in the game, first of all, rook f2 covers the base points. A move that may be tempting is a5, challenging the rook, but you would only be inviting the rook to a better square, really. b5 would become a hole. Rook is stable. Rook is out of the reach of any knight move with an attack. And the rook applies pressure to a knight and a pawn. It's going to place a great deal of restriction on white's camp. So, not a good idea to invite that rook up to an even better square. It's rook f2. In comes g5. Kings get to healthier squares. There was a pin here on the pawn. Maybe rook takes pawn in some cases with there being a pin. King healthier on a7. No knight moves with check now that it's on a7. All right, the rooks double up. And from here, g4 is played. Now it says best give some support to c7. g4 is a blunder. Pop quiz. How would you continue here? Feel free to pause the video. All right, the top move was not spotted. The top move is rook f7. In the game, queen c3 is played. You could play with rook f7. Now, how would this run exactly? Well, after queen takes h2, you don't run in and grab the pawn. You would have to first address the mate threat on b2. Rook 1 to f2 would be there. And here's the thing. Even if this queen reacts to this threat and keeps pressure on the rook, it doesn't matter. So, for instance, queen g1, this is the one I'm drawn to since it stays out of the way of the pawn. Could think about advancing. You could abandon the defense of the rook and swipe this c7 pawn. The point being, if the rook is captured, there is this trick on b7. This is a beautiful shot that was available to white. If you take the rook, it's going to be mate in 2. 1-2. And doing something else, moving the king, you just lose the rook right back, and there's mate right around the corner. No great way to stop that. Queen e2, knight d3 cuts off the queen. It's going to be mate shortly from here. So that was a nice possibility there available to white, immediately getting to that 7th rank, covering the 2nd, and abandoning defense of that rook, going in for that shot. Nice tricks here. The queen and knight are much better coordinated than black's queen and knight. No coordination at the moment between the black queen and knight. So in this one, no rook f7. It's queen c3. Queen c3 may have been played even with an eye on this possibility. Maybe a5 and rook b4. Queen also observes the e5 pawn here. Knight f3. This was the idea with g4 to try and clog up these rooks. So how to work around this one here? Well, we go with rook to g2, pressure on the pawn, and Carlsen's reply is with rook to g8. Now, if you swipe this pawn, you would really be asking for trouble. You're going to end up just tying yourself into a knot. You're in a pin here. You'd have to unpin like this. The rook really doesn't want to be there. a5 would be a strong idea. Queen e3 is nearby. That's looking like a disaster. And if you try to get out of this situation, this is going to get broken down. Remember that rook b6 move to defend the mate? It's not there anymore. So what are you going to do to defend the mate now? Rook here. That runs into knight d7. Queen c5 check right around the corner, winning the pawn. We're on the rook right now. And if you defend the pawn, you still go in here with check. And no matter what you do here, king move, pawn move, there's knight b6. You're going to be winning material shortly. There's a pin here. That would be a disaster. And what would also be a disaster in this situation is if you play b6 because of this monster knight post on e6. Made possible in part because of this big d5 pawn. Problem here, here. There isn't a solution here for black. Ready to capture, get to the 7th rank, win this pawn back, get another piece into the mix. That will quickly collapse if black is going pawn hunting. Important not to go after pawns like this and tie yourself into a knot. So the reply here to rook g2 is rook g8, Possibilities now in many lines for white to swipe the knight and then win the rook if it is unprotected. So what does this mean? There is a bit of a restriction on the black queen to fend off this trick on f3. From here, nice coordination, no fear of any capture on h2, b2 strengthened. From here, rook d6, queen e3, and king a8. That marks move 36. Players have only about 1 minute each. From here, knight e6, and from here, c6 is played. Best is king to b8. Time pressure. Carlsen cracked at this point. He played c6, trying to undermine the knight, but now this rook is vulnerable to the following move. Top move, queen a3. Perfect. Another winning move, I should say, is queen b6. Pin of the pawn, setting up knight c7, knight takes a6 ideas. Even better, this move right here. Very direct. Your rook is unprotected now because of c6. What are you going to do about it? What are black's options? You can't defend the rook with the rook. And you can't defend the rook with the queen because of that trick on f3. Rook unprotected. So what are your options? Well, if you try moving the rook, the queen is coordinating with the knight on this distant square, f8, for a fork. It's beautiful. What does Carlsen try? Exchange sacrifice. Rook takes knight. Pawn takes rook. And from here, rook c8 was played. Carlsen, a few moments later, disgusted with his position, ended up resigning. No hope here. We have a passed pawn, very dangerous passed pawn. And a simple way to follow up, if the game continued here, why not win that g-pawn? Remove the defender of the knight, and the rooks are going to sweep in one way or the other. Push a passed pawn, plenty of approaches, completely passive rook. And this one is officially over. This was an excellent game by Keymer from a very complex start position, number 360. Anyhow, what are your thoughts on this one? Feel free, as usual, to leave any feedback to this video in the comment section below. I hope you enjoyed it and maybe took a thing or two away. That's all for now. Take care. Bye.